Welcome on. Thank you for your interest in outreach to conservatives on climate policy. Your voice is important in this space, and we hope the talks that are in front of you today will be helpful. All lines are going to be muted throughout the presentations today. If you have questions, please go to your chat and ask them to Ask Me Todd or Ask Me Amanda. Anybody else that you ask a question to, it will be some of our moderators that might not be looking at their chat as much. If we have time at the end of each session, we'll pick some questions to answer from the questions that are sent to Ask Me Todd or Ask Me Amanda. By the end of Tuesday, if you are registered, you're going to receive a link to recordings of these calls. You are in the right place to hear Alex Flint talk about the conservative case for a price on carbon. Alex is the director of the Alliance for Market Solutions, an organization of conservative leaders addressing two of America's most pressing challenges: the need to reduce carbon pollution and grow the economy. Before being at the Alliance for Market Solutions, Alex served as a staff director of the U.S. Senate Committee on Energy and Natural Resources, served as a senior vice president of governmental affairs at the Nuclear Energy Institute, and served as a member of President Trump's transition team. So please join me in welcoming Alex Flint.
Jim, it is a pleasure to see you. And it's wonderful to be on a Zoom call with 498 participants now. I mean, it's just tremendous. I want to start by complimenting and thanking CCL for the work that you do. My role in trying to address climate change is very different than CCL's. I spent the first decades of my career working on Capitol Hill in the small rooms, watching the deals come together. It was a tremendous opportunity for me. I enjoyed it a lot. I learned a lot about the way politics works in Washington, but I also came to appreciate that fundamentally in a representative democracy, over time, the policies reflect the will of the citizens. And as much as what goes on in Washington is important to the legislative process, what happens at the grassroots, what happens back in members' homes and in the districts is a crucial component of a very complex system of governance in this country. CCL does a tremendous job at engaging in grassroots politics. And so for those of you who may be new to this or are just beginning to understand CCL or haven't seen other political organizations operate, I want to tell you that CCL is top tier and does an exceptional job. The grassroots programs are impactful. The bipartisanship is very important, and the persistence, which is a hallmark of CCL, gives it great credibility with members. It also occurs to me that this group of 500 people and this 20 minutes that I have to talk to you today may be one of the most important conversations that I have, because whether it's collectively as a group or some of you individually, you have the potential to shift the climate conversation in Washington. Let me give you a little bit of a perspective of where we stand. First, don't take this as being overly pessimistic, but we are not on the verge of a climate deal in Washington. The importance of climate is clearly rising to politicians. The conversation is getting more urgent, but we are far from a consensus on what to do about climate change. Democrats, for the last 15 to 20 years, have had the upper hand, have been on the high ground when it comes to talking about the need to address climate change. But even left of center, there is not an agreement on what to do. We saw cap and trade legislation pursued 10 years ago. My view is that it didn't even come close to having the votes necessary to pass in the Senate. Some have said cap and trade has fallen out of favor. Others have recognized that when you look at the way the committee process works in the Congress, cap and trade probably will emerge again among the authorizing committees in the Congress. And yet at the same time, it's important to recognize that the progressives have pulled many Democrats to the left, and there's now a real challenge just reaching consensus on the left. At the same time, Republicans who in the 1980s and previously were great on environment and climate issues have been lost for 2 decades. In the last several years, climate denialism has left the Republican Party. Our members no longer deny climate change. But what they don't know today is what to do about it. And so you see this division among the Democrats, and you see this recognition of the need to do something, but an uncertainty of the politics of it or what to do about it among conservatives. We do not yet have a consensus that has emerged in Washington. And yet when we do have a consensus that emerges, I assume most Democrats will support it. The key members of Congress are going to be the conservatives, many of whom CCL will at that point have been working on for years. And the people on this call are the ones who are going to convince those conservatives that they have to participate in a deal. That will do two things. The first is it will put together the coalition, the right and left of center coalition necessary to enact climate policy, but it also will ensure that that policy is durable, that it has support from both parties, so that when one party or the other loses power, the deal doesn't get undermined, so that it can last for the decades that we need in order to address climate change. So I would encourage you, fellow conservatives, do not be reticent about engaging on this issue. Do not be embarrassed that our party has not been present to working to address climate change for the last decade or so. Help us change the politics, help us change our party. You're on the right side of history. You're on the right side of science. As advocates of carbon tax, you're also on the right side of efficiency when it comes to the solution. And you're also talking about a policy that is consistent with where we are as a country with the long-term fiscal condition that we face, where my view at least is that we cannot afford to burden the economy with a huge overlay of regulations. And we similarly do not have the resources available to subsidize our way out of this challenge. So you're on the right side of the evolution of politics. You are the key component of putting a political deal together. The carbon tax, in my view, is the correct policy to be advocating. So now let me talk specifically about what I think you can do in this important time. The first is, I'll share a perspective about politicians from having worked with them for several decades at this point. There's an interesting phenomenon about House members in particular. I mean, we're all aware of the fact that they have to get reelected every 2 years. They have to campaign. I think the psychology of that, though, is lost on some people. In effect, they lose their jobs every 2 years. And there's a psychosis that sets in associated with that I think explains some of their worst behavior. They are constantly focused on the fact that they are on the verge of losing their job. That makes them pay a tremendous amount of attention to what is going on back in their districts. They're reading the social media, they're reading the newspapers, they're having the town hall meetings. They are very attuned to what is going on, and they are learning from it constantly. You need to participate in that education process. And what I want to suggest is that as individuals and collectively, we need to find our authentic voice in communicating with conservatives. Right now, my view is Republicans and conservative thought on climate are a jump ball. We don't know how over the next several years we are going to apply conservative values to climate change. And so what I want to do is just tell you about my own personal application of values to climate change, because one of the things that I think will be very important is that when you interact with members of Congress, you need to come across as authentic. There's a quote, Maya Angelou has a wonderful quote. It happens to hang on the wall in my daughter's room. And a couple of days ago, after Jim and I were talking, I walked past my daughter's room and I saw the quote hanging on the wall. Quote, "I've learned that people will forget what you said, people will forget what you did, but people will never forget how you made them feel." And what I would hope is that you will help make politicians feel an urgency, a need to address climate change by exploring your own values and applying them. So in my case, I believe that responsibility is a core conservative value. In my life, it means I overinsure my cars, my life. It means that I'm risk adverse. And so for me, I don't, for example, need to be proven. I don't need 100% of scientists to tell me that the climate is going to change. I don't need to know exactly what the consequences are going to be of sea level rise, of the increased intensity of hurricanes, of bark beetle infestations. I don't need to know exactly how much my beloved ski seasons are going to get shortened at the resorts through the Rocky Mountains. All I need to know is that there is a significant risk of those consequences. And for me, it's the application of being responsible that I think needs to guide us. And the reason it's important to approach this with values is that so when a politician says, well, what about this issue of it? You have an idea about how to express your values. So for example, I support a carbon tax because I want to disrupt the economy as little as possible, because I think it's important that the economy grow so that we can meet our obligations that the federal government has through Medicare and Social Security and other benefits programs. I also think it's not reasonable that we transform our energy economy through subsidies, because I'm very concerned about deficits. So when members talk to me about climate change and regulations and the possibility of subsidizing preferred technologies or the possibility of imposing a tax on externalities, I'm able to approach the topic through any one of those lenses and be consistent in the application of values. And that's what I think we really have to get done over the next year with conservatives in Congress. We have to convince them that there's an obligation out of responsibility and their own political self-interest to address climate change. And we need to teach them the values that they can apply. The details of the legislation, I think, are going to emerge over the next couple of years. And what we need them to do is to engage constructively and supportively and to mold that legislation so it's consistent with our values and can kind of get across the finish line. Now, what I believe is that means over the next couple of years, we're going to have a real debate in the Congress about what to do about climate change. And it may not be necessarily on the floor of the House and of the Senate. It will be in the committees. It will be among the think tanks doing their briefings. It will be with you going up to the Hill versus some of the Neanderthals who are still up there lobbying against climate change and and pursuing the delay phenomena. What will emerge, I believe, is a real debate between not whether to do something, but how to address climate change. Should we impose regulations and the associated costs with that? And mind you, I will tell you that politicians frequently support regulations. Should we subsidize this issue, which, by the way, industry generally supports? I was watching a utility CEO talk to members of Congress the other day, and he said, well, and he was asked about carbon pricing, and he said, well, in general, we prefer carrots to sticks. To which I think, well, of course. Most industry says, well, if you pay me to do something, I will respond. I get that. And I think the enthusiasm for regulations you see left of center and industry's general attraction to carrots rather than sticks, it makes it clear why today in Congress, most of the discussion is about should we regulate or should we subsidize in order to achieve our goals. The tax, the efficiency requires a sell. It requires an intellectual engagement. My counsel is become comfortable with it, recognize your unique role in this conversation, and convince the members that it is consistent with their ideology and their values. Over the long term, that will be what transforms the politics of this conversation. Jim, I'm 13 minutes into this. Shall we turn to questions?
Sure, I got one question from Trey in Wisconsin on most conservative conservationists, outdoorsmen, come to conservation through natural resources, and thus they're interested in changing climate. And many of those are conservative also. How best can we, as a grassroots organization, use this shared approach to engage House and members in the House and Senate, and then bridge to a carbon fee and dividend?
I think that
recommendations on that.
I think that Republicans, as they transform, need to take and necessarily will take baby steps. Congressman Carlos Curbelo was asked some time ago how we should treat Republicans when they take inadequate baby steps. And he said, well, on this issue, they are babies. And what we have to do is we have to celebrate those steps, and then we have to teach them eventually to run. So my suggestion to those who have a conservation background, I call it the hook and the bullet club, whatever you want, if that's the point at which you enter the conversation, I would come to that with real life experiences about what you are seeing out there and why you individually are motivated to address this issue, why your personal experience leads you to believe that this is something important. And I believe that whatever your background, that should be the approach that you take.
Great advice. So, question is, as we're approaching members of Congress, do you have any recommendations or suggestions that we might need to consider if we're approaching someone in a very safe district versus someone in maybe only an R+2 district?
So I think control of the Congress, I mean, the most interesting districts are the tough districts. Okay, they're the swing districts. One of the reasons Kevin McCarthy has said, the House Republican leader has said, the party has to change its position on climate change is that if the party wants to win control of the House, maintain control of the Senate, and I would contend prevail in future presidential races, we have to have ways of relating with the swing voters, the college-educated suburban voters who care about a number of issues, climate change being one of them. So I think the swing districts are one of the most important things. We do a fair bit of polling in the swing districts. You can comfortably say that climate is an important differentiating issue for swing voters, that if politicians are thinking about how to win in the general election, they should seriously consider acknowledging climate change and committing to work to address climate change. In the conservative Republican districts, I think it has to be a changing of the application of conservative values. If it's a safe Republican district where they don't have to change their views on climate change and they will keep getting elected, I think you sit with them and you convince them that being responsible about climate is a core conservative value. And that over time, I do believe there can be long-term shifts in the polarization of any issue in American politics. In the end, my goal is that decades from now, conservatives will be the most responsible individuals when it comes to climate change, because we will have a conservation ethos, we will have an element of responsibility, we will have identified the most efficient, lowest cost means of protecting the climate, and that we will be the trusted group when it comes to addressing climate change. So in that safer conservative Republican district, change the ideology.
Great. So listeners observed that you use the word carbon tax fairly freely, and sometimes we are reluctant to use that word because it has connotations and there are a lot of people writing against it. What are your thoughts on using the word carbon tax directly versus finding other ways to say the same thing?
You have to have authentic conversations with politicians. Do not go in there using message tested garbage words that imply things, but you're not comfortable talking about it. You need to be direct. You also need to understand that if you go in there and you use, I don't know, some other language to talk about it, when you leave, the senator or congressman will go, those are the carbon tax people. You might as well be straightforward about it. Also recognize, I mean, and this, my view is that the House Ways and Means Committee and the Senate Finance Committee, the committees that have jurisdiction over taxes, are the committees that in the end are going to deliver climate legislation in the Congress, because it is going to be a carbon tax. They talk about taxes all the time. They like some taxes, they dislike taxes. Have a conversation about, should we be taxing earnings and income, or should we be taxing consumption, or should we do a VAT tax, or should we do a carbon tax? That is the conversation they have. If you try to talk about it in some squishy way, they won't respect you because you're not being upfront and you're not talking the language of the realm. Be direct, be authentic.
Great. And one last question. A lot of what we're talking about here takes so much time. Many people on this call have been at this for years. Do you have suggestions for conveying a sense of urgency to try and speed up this process we've all been working on together?
I think the urgency challenge is real. I think you have to go into meetings with members of Congress with your ears wide open. Listen well. There are some members for whom the urgency message causes them to feel some compulsion, a responsibility to act. There are others for whom the urgency message makes them, whether they admit it or not, throw up their hands like, well, there's nothing we can do, and so I'm not going to do it. And the same has to do with when you describe the scale of the challenge. There are members who will say, we have to address this. There are members who say, it's too big, we can't address it, we're just going to have to do adaptation. That message
on that note, Alex, and speaking of urgency, I'm going to cut you off and say thanks you very much for coming here and sharing your ideas with us. We will.
Thank you for listening to this episode of Citizens Climate Lobby's training program. You can tune into more episodes anywhere podcasts are available. Inspired by what you heard today? Join Citizens Climate Lobby to advocate for bipartisan climate solutions. Go to community.citizensclimate.org to find more trainings, resources, your local chapter, national action teams, discussion forums, and more. Be sure to like our Facebook page and follow us on Twitter and Instagram @CitizensClimate. We also invite all of our listeners to subscribe to our YouTube channel for more inspiration. And together, we are creating the political will for a livable world.